Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Why Everyone Plays. Today's a bit of a special one. So normally I don't talk about champions in either series unless they've been around for a long time, like at least a few years. Well, except for Nico, but we're not going to talk about that. Anyway, I'm breaking my own rules again and covering a very recent champion who's been slashing through the rift ever since he came out, Yone the Unforgotten. Now, I could just be boring and attribute his popularity to... But no, we're actually going to take this seriously. Before we talk about Yone, I think it's important to talk about the Slayers in League of Legends. Skirmishers and Assassins are two very popular subclasses because they carry all the things that most players want. Good damage, good mobility, high carry potential, and skill expression. It's no surprise that some of the most picked champions like Yasuo, Yone, Kha'Zix, Zed, and Katarina and such belong to one of those two. The key differences between an Assassin and Skirmisher goes as follows. Assassins often come with much less crowd control or sometimes none at all, but usually have way better mobility in tempo and/or combat, and generally they have more options for escape than Skirmishers. In terms of damage, much of their power is front-loaded, meaning they can execute their main combos within a matter of seconds or less. However, this comes at the cost of many Assassins being extremely easy to one-shot themselves if they're careless about their movements. Skirmishers deal just as much damage as Assassin counterparts, but it takes a little more time. Not as slow as Juggernauts and Fighters, but it's rare to see someone like Yasuo one-shot a squishy AD carry in half a second the way someone like Talon can. In exchange, they're armed with higher battle pressure. Skirmishers are well respected for their ability to remain a constant threat in a fight at all times, having low cooldown abilities and access to at least one situational defensive tool to give them a way out. When it comes to which one is considered stronger than the other, I'd say they're about equal. Assassins are just as capable of beating Skirmishers as Skirmishers are Assassins, but you may have noticed when I showed you the two subclasses on screen. There was a certain somebody that happened to be in both categories, Yone. It's rare to find a champion who can double in multiple roles even in spite of Riot's supposed abandonment of their design principles. I know there are memes about Kai'Sa being Assassin, Mage, DPS, early game, mid game, late game, hyper carry, top jungle, mid ADC support all the time, but there are only like 20 champions in the game out of over 150 who are specifically designated in multiple subclasses. Yone is the only champion in the game who's simultaneously a Skirmisher and Assassin. While it's possible for someone like Fiora or Jax to completely one-shot a squishy target, they're first and foremost made to be duelists. Conversely, someone like Rengar or Akali can hold their own in long extended fights due to their unique self-peel, but they're meant to be Assassins. I know there might be some comments asking, what about Kayn? Red form is a Skirmisher and blue form is an Assassin. Correct, but they're also two completely different champions with different kits, so it's not right to look at them as a single entity. Assassins are capable of unloading inconceivable amounts of burst damage on a single target, but they generally have to retreat until their cooldowns are back online provided they're not already winning the fight. If they fail to dispatch an enemy champion with one rotation, they themselves will be wide open for a few seconds, enough for most AD carries in the mid to late game to actually turn the tides on them with their superior DPS. Such an issue doesn't exist for Yone because he has a good number of traits of both Assassins and Skirmishers mixed together, creating quite literally a champion that can do both jobs with the same build, in the same game, under the same circumstances at the same time. Yone's best selling point is his versatility. There are so many tools contained in his kit that some champions wouldn't have even half of. He has damage, he has crowd control, he has burst, he has AoE, he has mobility, he can teamfight, he can 1v1, he's nearly impossible to itemize against. There's so much stuff in his kit that while his numbers aren't nearly as high as other champions, he more than makes up for it due to the sheer amount of stuff he can do. Even though most of the time Yone feeds as much as Yasuo does, the threat of him potentially being able to 1v9 is very much real and happens more often than you might think. Just like his brother, all it takes is a super wombo combo explosion in the mid game for a 0 and 10 Yone to suddenly become the highest priority carry on his team. Not to mention, he's much less situational than Yasuo. It's the chance, no matter how small, that he could hyper carry that makes people really want to pick him up, since everyone's no doubt seen multiple games where there was a fed Yone that was unstoppable to deal with. For starters, let's talk about exactly what's in his kit. Way of the Hunter is his passive, which is actually the mildest part of his gameplay. He shares the same crit multiplier as Yasuo where he reaches 100% crit chance with only 2 items as opposed to 5. In exchange, he does less damage per critical strike, but overall it's a net positive. The second part of his passive sets the tone for the rest of his kit. Every attack that uses his Azakana sword, the red one, deals hybrid damage, meaning he does half physical, half magic damage. At a glance, it doesn't seem like anything too special given that Corki shares a similar passive. and neither champion gains bonus damage, just different damage. But I'll get into why this is so powerful later on. His Q, Mortal Steel, has exactly the same animation, range, and everything as Yasuo's Steel Tempest, a frontal thrust that deals physical damage, but instead of throwing a tornado, Yone's third Q has him dash forward, knocking up all enemies he passes through, just like Jarvan the Fourth's EQ combo. Given that at max attack speed Q has only a 1.3 second cooldown, every 4 seconds in combat, Yone gets access to a dashing ability that deals a lot of damage and also displaces enemies, making this in some cases a straight upgrade to Yasuo's Steel Tempest. Onto his W Spirit Cleave, where Yone slashes a large area in front of him in the shape of a cone, dealing % max health hybrid damage to all targets he hits, and shielding himself if at least one enemy is struck, which increases in strength for every champion. Not the most complex ability out there until you take notice to the fact that it shares the same attack speed scaling as his Q, causing Spirit Cleave to strike faster and have a lower cooldown based on his attack speed. Yone has two abilities that receive both a faster attack animation and a lower cooldown just by building what he normally would build. Moreover, this is another ability that deals mixed hybrid damage, so not only does Yone's basic attacks have hybrid damage, but so does his W. Soul Unbound is where things get really interesting. There's a lot of stuff to explain with this attack, but in layman's terms, Yone's spirit leaves his body and can attack you. After 5 seconds or upon recast, he dashes back to his body and causes you to take bonus true damage based on the damage you already took. It doesn't matter how far away he is from his original position, Yone will always snap back. You're probably thinking to yourself, this sounds oddly familiar to a certain assassin's ultimate. Soul Unbound is nearly identical to Zed's Deathmark fundamentally speaking, but in some cases it might actually be better. While Zed's ultimate can be used to dodge attacks due to it being untargetable and the detonation damage is much higher, Yone's Soul Unbound does a percentage of the damage he's already dealt in true damage, which means if he took 1000 damage while his spirit was attacking you, you're guaranteed to take 250 to 350 true damage afterwards. It doesn't matter how much armor you have. Now of course, Zed's advantage is that he has the option to choose if he wants to blink back to his shadow, while for Yone it's compulsory. But Deathmark can only apply to one target, whereas Soul Unbound can apply to multiple targets. Oh and yes, this is just his E. His ultimate is Fate Sealed, a huge dash in the line that stops on the farthest enemy champion, drags all enemies to the spot he lands in, knocks them up, and stuns them while dealing hybrid damage to all targets. The huge area coverage this ability offers allows Yone to single-handedly wipe out the enemy team if all of them stand in his line of fire. It carries the same destructive power as Yasuo's Last Breath without need for a knockup to activate it. So having explained all of his abilities, let's tally up what he has. 3 of his attacks deal hybrid damage, his passive, W, and ultimate. 1 of his abilities deals partial true damage. His W deals a very high amount of % max health damage. He has 3 dashes in the form of Q, E, and ultimate, giving him some of the best combat mobility in the entire game. All 4 of his abilities deal AoE damage, including his E since it applies to whoever he hits. And he has access to a fairly substantial shield with a low cooldown thanks to his W. This guy has an extremely overloaded kit, that's not even an exaggeration. He genuinely is one of the most stacked champions in the game. Since he does hybrid damage, all defensive itemization that isn't health only has half its effectiveness. Building armor or tabbies doesn't work against him as well as it does with other AD skirmishers or assassins, because he not only does magic damage, but he also does on-hit and spell damage equally. This combined with his % max health and partial true damage makes him equipped to fight even fighters, juggernauts, and tanks since he can shred through them. Those champions are normally supposed to be the counters to skirmishers and assassins. It's all of these aspects that make him such a potential threat to the enemy team. We all know the famous Yasuo 10 death power spike where even if he's feeding harder than the Red Cross in Africa, he still somehow manages to one-shot the entire enemy team with just 3 items. Yone has that very same 10 death power spike, if not better. Although he has no wind wall, so no way to completely screw over 80 carries, but who cares when you have everything else? It's not just what's in his kit that makes him so appealing, but how his kit plays out. I often talk about player satisfaction and user experience in Why No One Plays, where some of the champions in that series have a really good concept in theory, but in practice it seems to fall flat on its face. Yone has one of the best user experiences in the game. His abilities are extremely flashy and devastating while being easy to understand. Most people can get a handle on how to play him in just a few games. Nothing about him feels awkward or clunky, and while it may take some time to optimize his trait patterns and dueling, even novices won't waste any time making extravagant 1v9 plays to grab some juicy karma on Reddit. All of his abilities can be sequenced off of each other. For example, you can open up with E, then use ultimate to close the gap, mash Q and W to get a bunch of burst damage before blinking back to safety. Alternatively, you can prime your third Q, use your E to knock up the target to guarantee landing your ultimate before using the same combo. Or if you're looking for an easy trade combo, you can just prime Q, use E to Q in, then get a W and a couple autos, then blink back to safety without taking any damage. If it's not obvious to you by now, a lot of Yone's stupid bullshit stems from the fact that he has his Z ultimate for a basic ability on like an 8-second cooldown late game, which means he can dive in, do a whole bunch of damage, then blink out. Granted, its usefulness only applies for offense and not so much for self-peel, but there's so many things you can do with Soul Unbound that makes him such an enjoyable champion to play. It can be used to assassinate, to teamfight, to 1v1. This ability would likely be up there next to Camille's Q, Pyke's ultimate, or Akali's Shroud in terms of overpowered abilities. Continuing on with his ease of use and really versatile kit, part of what makes Yone a favorable pick in almost any game is his hyper consistency. Regardless of where he is on the map or how something happens, he can start or respond to fights instantaneously, not even needing to prime his third Q because his W and ultimate can be activated right from the get-go, both of which can buy you time or outright kill anyone if you manage to land your entire combo. Now Yasuo might have a lot more potential combat mobility than Yone if there are a lot of enemy minions, monsters, or champions around because he can use Sweeping Blade equal to the number of targets there are. Not to mention his wind wall middle fingers any ranged champion, but both of those have an external locus of control. Wind wall does nothing against melee champions including other skirmishers, and if he's in a fight with no minions or surroundings to dash through, he can be easily wiped out by the vast majority of carries. Last Breath does beat out Fate Sealed in damage late game, not to mention the 50% armor penetration buff, but it also requires airborne enemies. Depending on who you ask, this can be a positive or a negative. There are a great deal of champions with knockups nowadays, so very rarely do you find a Yasuo in a team where his Q is the only one. So he can synergize really well with hard engaged tanks for instance, and Windwall not only protects him, but his allies, so he's not entirely selfish. Comparably speaking, Yone's defensive tools and dodging are in a class below his kid brother, and he is a completely selfish champion since none of his attacks interact with his allies outside of the damage they bring. But he compensates for it by being less reliant on extrinsic factors, making him completely independent. So overall, he doesn't scale nearly as well if we talk about sheer damage, but he's a champion that ties strongly with the solo queue 1v9 mindset. I'm not implying Yone is a straight upgrade to Yasuo in every way, but he certainly is more self-sufficient. Lastly, and this is an aspect of him I think few people actually pay attention to, but Yone's pressure variance is curved in a way that disproportionately rewards players more for the effort they put in than if they were to use that same effort on another champion. Likewise, he's punished less for any errors on the player's part, which would have been much more crippling if you were playing on another champion. So you get rewarded more for good things and punished less for bad things. I often make the statement in Why No One Plays episodes that extremely difficult characters like Azir, Kindred, Callista and such have such low player satisfaction because you have to put in twice or thrice the effort to achieve the same result on them that you would on any other champion in the same category. Even though skill expression is a defining component of making champs enjoyable to play, it's important that you also balance out the output to match or be better than the input. Going one step back just to go one step forward is not gratifying for players. Going one step back 2 steps forward is. See, Yone has had a sub 50% win rate ever since he came out. He never was all that strong to begin with, but that's because he has such a high pick rate, and since so many players pick him, for every one good Yone player there's like 2 or 3 bad ones. Those who do play him really well can consistently hold 55 to 60% win rates on him because again, all it takes is 1 or 2 really solid plays to propel him into a state where he's nearly unstoppable. And even if you do fall behind early on him, he scales so incredibly well since he does hybrid damage, percent health damage, has really strong AoE burst and crowd control, all that stuff. This guy reminds me of those one-hit KO moves in Pokemon, Horn Drill, Guillotine, Sheer Cold, and Fissure. They only hit 30% of the time, but when they do, you're basically screwed. And anyone who's played Pokemon long enough knows just how many times they missed Focus Blast and how many times Scald left a burn. 30% happens way more often than you might think. Even though it's more likely the average Yone will probably feed to hell, the longer it takes for you to close the game out, the more chances you give him of myrtleizing your whole team. For most hyper carries like Fiora, Master Yi, and Kog'Maw, they only have a 10 to 20% chance of bringing it back if they fall behind, whereas Yone's is like 30%. That risk is high enough for it to be obligatory for you to respect it. So, After watching this video, you now feel like playing him, which means my job here is done. So I hope everybody enjoys extra feeding Yones in your ranked games. If you enjoyed this video, a rating would be much appreciated, and if you'd like to see more content like this, consider subscribing to the channel. Also check out the description down below for links to my Discord and social media, as well as a playlist containing all my Why Everyone Plays videos if you'd like to watch more. There's also a sister series called Why No One Plays. But that's it for today. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon for the next one. Take care.